Howdy, my name is Ben Crockett with 451 Now, and today's guest is George Will. He is an American columnist, political philosopher. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He writes regularly for the Washington Post and produces commentary that can be read in many different places, including NBC News and MSNBC. Today, we're going to be talking to him about his book, American Happiness and Discontents. Mr. Will, it is a pleasure to have you on.
It's great to be with you.
So I had to start off and ask, what's on your 3x5 card?
You mean coming columns? Well, I can actually show you. It's a 3x5 card cut in half, actually. And right now there are three of them. I'm going to write yet another denunciation of the New York Times 1619 project, its attempt to distort American history. There's a Supreme Court case coming on the Indian Child Welfare Act. There's a book I'm going to write about called Rescuing Socrates. It's about a Dominican immigrant who about 30 years ago came to this country and wound up teaching the Common Core at Columbia University. Oh, let's see. I've got something on that. I'm going to write on the confirmation of Jay Powell to be another term at the head of the Fed. It's a very good study from the Cato Institute. All their studies are excellent in my judgment on the importance of wealthy people to the flourishing of our society. That gives you some sense of what's coming.
That does. So I guess as a follow-up, what's your process for writing an essay? Some people, they sit down and the words just come to them, and others, they seem to have to plan meticulously with painstaking detail what they're going to write. How do you sit down and write one of your famous columns?
Well, very often I write not to say what I think, but to find out what I think. I spend a lot of time. If people say, "What do you do?" I suppose I'd say I'm a writer, but I'm really a reader. I spend more time reading than writing, clipping good essays that I like and good articles that I like. I have files all over my office for coming columns. I like to think that my columns are fact-heavy. I know we appear on the opinion pages, but opinion's a fairly small part of my columns, I think. One of the nicest compliments I ever received was from someone who was a fact checker at the Washington Post Writers Group, which is the outfit that syndicates my column to my hundreds of newspapers. And this fact checker said that what surprised her most when she got to it was the number of facts in my columns, which I think nothing is more optional than reading a syndicated column. So it had better, A, be fun, which means well-written and have a little... In almost every column I write, there's a point where I hope the reader will at least smile, if not laugh out loud. But learning things is a pleasure. And I think people, if they think they're going to get the pleasure of putting the paper down after 750 words saying, I didn't know that before. I think that's the secret to longevity in this business.
You touched on the importance of deep reading, something that you wrote about in your column in this collection entitled In Praise of Binge Reading. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more between the connection between deep writing, deep thought, and deep reading.
Yes, indeed. It seems to me for all our besotted obsession with the new media, Facebook, the internet, blogging, all the rest, books remain what they have been since Mr. Gutenberg made books democratized with movable type. They remain the primary carriers of ideas. And if you believe, as I emphatically do, that not just that ideas have consequences, to repeat the title of one of the canonical works of the post-war conservative movement, but that only ideas have large and lasting consequences. If you believe that, then books are central to the business of public commentary. And by deep reading, I mean the engagement with a book, the engagement with writing rather than listening or watching videos, the discipline of following sentences into paragraphs and paragraphs into chapters, the immersion in a long fact buttressed argument is important for actually the sinews of mind necessary for a democracy. Some people, this is a minority taste and a minority skill, and if that sounds elitist, I plead guilty cheerfully. But it is a skill that an elite portion of a society needs to have to encounter complex arguments and complex problems. And you can only do that with the skill of what is called deep reading. You
reminded me of a famous quote from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington about the sort of elite taste of reading. And it seems like reading on a broader scale has become something of a lost cause. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there's this famous scene in where they say something like, "Oh, it's a lost cause." And the main character replies, "Oh, but lost causes are the only causes worth fighting for."
Lord knows I've backed enough lost causes in my day. I spent 2 years at Oxford, which is famously known as the home of lost causes. But not all causes are lost, and not all lost causes are lost forever. There are ways to resuscitate good ideas and good causes.
I had one more thought on the article in praise of binge reading. In it, you say, yet even among young people in higher education, many professors will not assign entire books or substantial portions of challenging ones. Why?
Well, because increasingly universities, and by the way, most universities have in effect open admissions. That is, if you have the tuition on a pulse, you can get in. Most universities now are in a competition for students, and they are look upon students as customers for their services. There are very few highly selective institutions of higher education. You know, you can. Someone printed up a T-shirt not long ago that said, "College, those magic 7 years between high school and your first warehouse job." Abundant research demonstrates that students today are studying less, reading less, writing less than they used to do. Many of them go to the school that has the best Mongolian barbecue in the student union. So put me down as someone who's not enthralled with the current state of higher education. The very phrase suggests the question, higher than what exactly?
I will not name the institution of which I'm about to refer, but it was only a short time ago that I was looking for various universities to apply to. And in the mail, my mom will remember this moment very clearly. In the mail, I received a package, a infographic from one of these institutes of higher education from the state of Louisiana. I won't say which Louisiana university it was, but it advertised the proximity of this university to bars, and it also said that it had the most festival days of any university in the country. Now, I won't say which university it was, but it does seem like there is a trend to de-educate, de-strenuize, if that's even a word, higher education, and turn it into a quote-unquote experience, which can be bought.
Exactly. And education should be fun, but the fun should come from the thrill of arduous engagement for 4 years with the best that has been written and thought, to use the language of Matthew Arnold.
I often find myself agreeing with your columns, Mr. Will, but you wrote one that's included in this collection, Happiness and Discontent, called The Plague of Denim. And in it, you say, it is a straight line from the fall of the Bastille to the rise of denim. Mr. Will, blue jeans? Really?
I'll tell you, yes, really, and I'll tell you why. I got tired of sitting in airport concourses. I travel a lot, and watching people go by, a 40-year-old father and his 12-year-old son walking down the concourse. They're dressed exactly alike. Running shoes, blue jeans, a collarless T-shirt, baseball cap. And if mother's with them, she too is wearing blue jeans. And it kept occurring to me that I could dimly remember a time when different stages of life were demarcated by different ways of dressing. One put away childish things, to use the language of scripture, and dressed like an adult. The tendency to blur what should be momentous changes in our life status is why, behind this somewhat playful denunciation of denim, which is certainly the most talked about column in that book, there's a serious point there that I think people ought to embrace growing up and resist the childishness that seems to creep into the adult sphere of life.
You just quoted a bit of the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians, which brings me to my next question, my next inquiry. You're a conservative, light atheist, I guess, might be a good description. But do you still find utility in the scriptures?
Look, absolutely. Christianity is woven into the fiber of the Western world. The King James Version is one of the triumphant products of the Western literary canon. I have described myself as an amiable, low-voltage atheist. I'm not trying to talk anyone out of their faith, least of all my wife, who's a ferocious Presbyterian. It's just that I grew up in a secular household and have, although I'm interested in religion, I was a religion major as an undergraduate. It just never caught my fancy, other than as something important to a great many people and important in the shaping of history.
Interesting. I guess it's been a non-issue in your life, would probably be a good description.
Well, that's right. My father's father was a Lutheran minister in Pennsylvania, northern Maryland, eastern Ohio. And my father, as a young man, young boy really, would sit outside Pastor Will's study and listen to the Pastor Will reasoning with some of his more reflective parishioners in trying to reconcile grace and free will. And this turned my father not into a Lutheran, but into a philosopher, a professor of philosophy. And I'm a faculty brat. He was at the University of Illinois for 37 years. Made him philosophical. And again, religion, I just never encountered it in growing up in Champaign, Illinois.
I see what you mean. At the beginning, you said, at the beginning of this podcast, at the beginning of this interview, you said that one of the reasons why you write is because it helps you to refine what you think. And in your response to that previous question, I saw, snippets of so many little articles. There's a very well developed tone in your writing. And what's interesting to me is it seems like you almost speak in the same way that you write.
Well, it's the same language, for goodness sakes. Why wouldn't I? I like to think that I can speak in paragraphs. I know that in the Twitterverse, which we are now enmeshed, I'm told I've never tweeted in my life. I'm told I have a Facebook page, but I've never seen it. Someone on my staff sends out however many characters there are nowadays in Twitter from my columns twice a week, but that's it. It seems to me that Twitter is a retrograde development in our midst because it encourages what needs no more encouragement than modern life itself encourages, which is a short attention span, which takes us back in hailing distance of the question of deep reading.
Perhaps another one of those lost causes.
Yeah, well, not lost. You see, again, most Americans don't read newspapers, and most of those who do read newspapers don't read op-ed columns. Now, that depresses some people in my business. It doesn't depress me, because what it means is we have a small but upscale, intellectually upscale, self-selected audience that brings to reading columns, which they do voluntarily out of curiosity and interest. They have mental pantries stocked full of information and opinions and historical references and all the rest, which means you can talk to them about serious matters in 750 words, because you can assume on their part a certain foundation of knowledge. It doesn't bother me a bit to recognize the obvious, which is that those of us who write as public intellectuals are having a small conversation with a self-selected minority group.
One of the articles I wanted to talk to you about was entitled "Iceland's Final Solution to the Down Syndrome Problem." Mr. Will, as you know, recently the Supreme Court has heard oral arguments on a case involving a Mississippi abortion law. What's your general sense of the wind? Do you think that in the future in America we will have, a Icelandic situation, or do you think in the future in America we will have an alternative one?
I think the future in America, we're apt to have 50 different legal regimes regulating abortion. Abortion was, until 1973 and Roe v. Wade, well within the regulatory police powers of the states. It was taken away from them by improvidently and with execrable constitutional reasoning by Roe v. Wade. Something, by the way, that people like John Hart Ely, a great professor of constitutional law, said, even though Ely and others support permissive abortion policies, I can see no reason for the court to have accepted the Mississippi case unless it, at a minimum, wanted to get away from the viability threshold as the standard at which restrictions on abortion become unconstitutional. And perhaps even, there are now 6 votes, perhaps 5 certainly, to overturn Roe v. Wade and restore it to a political question to be debated and settled in 50 jurisdictions, plus the District of Columbia. We would have very different outcomes, and I'm not sure that will happen. But it seems to me that the court's reasoning in Roe and then in Casey, the Pennsylvania case in 92, 19 years after Roe, the reasoning is so slapdash and unconvincing, and that I think a majority on the court may want to throw up its hands and say, let's get out of this business, because you really cannot rehabilitate Roe as constitutional law.
It seems almost like you're in favor of legislative deference in this circumstance.
Yeah, well, I'm not, and I want to make clear this. The problem with abortion is the fundamental difference is over how many people are involved. Is it one person or 2? That is, at what point do you say there's another person in the form of the unborn child? And this is a vexing question that has puzzled people for centuries, long before embryology came along, long before sonograms came along, to give us the picture of a preborn baby in the early months of gestation, sucking its thumb, batting its eyes with a beating heart, and moving its fingers, and all the rest. I'm not. This is a serious argument about which intelligent people of goodwill can and do disagree. But so I'm really not advocating judicial deference. I've been doing this, not writing columns now for about 50 years, and I'm frequently asked, on what important matter have you changed your mind? And this is it. When I came to Washington in 1970, 3 years before becoming a columnist, I had the typical conservative rhetoric of judicial restraint, looking back on the somewhat freewheeling jurisprudence of the Warren Court. I have subsequently decided I was mistaken. I'm 180 degrees different. I'm now for what is called, from people like Clark Neely, now at the Cato Institute, judicial engagement. And my argument goes, can I give you a little 3-minute tour of the horizon here? I grew up in central Illinois, Champaign, Urbana. And according to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Abraham Lincoln, then a traveling, very prosperous railroad lawyer, was when he heard that Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator, had succeeded in passing through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. The purpose of this was to solve the question that was rending the Union as to what to do about the question of slavery in the territories where federal jurisdiction ran. In Kansas, Nebraska, and others, could people take slaves into the territory? Could there be slavery, a whole regime of law to protect property and other human beings? Stephen A. Douglas's answer was popular sovereignty in the territories. Vote it up, vote slavery down, a matter of moral indifference, because the morally important point was majority should rule. Lincoln's ascent to greatness began with his canny, implacable recoil against this. He said, America is not about a process majority rule. America is about liberty. And I've really been working on this problem since I wrote my doctoral dissertation at Princeton, called the title of which was Beyond the Reach of Majorities. It's a phrase from the flag salute case, the second of the two flag salute cases. In 1939, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that the state of Pennsylvania could indeed, by majority rule, compel minorities, in this case Jehovah's Witnesses children, to do something contrary to their conscience and salute the flag. Just 4 years later, in a case from West Virginia, also involving Jehovah's Witnesses children, the Supreme Court reversed itself. And it said the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, above the vicissitudes of politics. A constitution is an inherently anti-majoritarian device. First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or establishing a religion. Even if a majority wants it, we don't care. We took that off the table. And it seems to me much of what makes a civilized society is the number of things not submitted to majority rule. Obviously, majority rule is important, but it is not all important. So Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a great majoritarian, said, if the American people want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job. Well, I think that's not your job. That's not the job of someone construing the Constitution. Construing the Constitution is to preserve the Constitution, which has, this is inherent in the idea of a written Constitution, restrictions on the discretion of majorities. At
what point in our history do you think we shifted from this pro-liberty, anti-majoritarianism into this democracy above all else? Was it, with the passage of the 17th Amendment, for example? When did it all sort of change?
Well, I can actually give you a sort of a precise date of 1937. That's when the court shifted to become deferential to the New Deal's expansion of the government in ways that it had hitherto resisted, to the point that it provoked FDR's plan to pack the Supreme Court. But it really, I would say that the real shift began with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to criticize the American founding, which he did not do peripherally, but root and branch. He said the separation of powers was all very well when we were a country of 4 million people, 80% of whom lived within 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater. But now we're a great nation united by steel rails and copper wires across the continent. And we need a nimble, that was one of his favorite descriptions of the sort of government he wanted, a nimble government led by a forceful president who would not be inhibited by and impeded by and tied down by the separation of powers. He wanted a more efficient government. He was, after all, one of the first presidents of the American Political Science Association. Science was in the air at that time, at the turn of the century. Marconi, Edison, the Wright brothers, Henry Ford. And people like the progressives were all hot to apply science, the science of public administration, to public policy, particularly through a strong, unfettered executive. Now, if you believe, as I do, and there's much in my book about trying to recage the executive lion, to use a phrase from some of the good writing on the problem of unhinged presidents, then you understand that this really began with Woodrow Wilson.
I want to sort of end out our conversation today with a number of different questions about books and about reading. Whenever anyone reads one of your columns, it is immediately apparent how wide read you are. And I was wondering if you could give us a few of the George Will book recommendations.
Well, first let me say, I get up at 5:20 every morning, and at 5:21, I'm listening to an Audible book. By the time I get to work, having showered, shaved, exercised, I go for fast walks in the morning every day. By the time I get to work, I've been listening to a book for 2.5 hours. I go through 70 or 80 books a year in otherwise wasted time. Great books. Let me give you just eclectically. You want to know what good writing is, want to know what the 1619 Project doesn't understand, read Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, and then read The Creation of the American Republic by Gordon Wood, and also by Gordon Wood, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. You want to know how history ought to be written, and is mostly written nowadays, not by academic historians who are mostly hopeless, but by talented amateurs, if you will. Get Daniel Okrent's book called The Last Call. It's a history of prohibition. It's a great study in the law of unintended consequences, which is important to conservatives. That law being that the unintended consequences of government interventions in society are apt to be larger than and contrary to the intended consequences. I could go on and give you all kinds of books, but this is a golden age of great writing about American history.
I tell you what, can we transition and get some fiction recommendations? Because I think that sometimes fiction can transmit those more spiritual truths, those sort of, archetypal stories, and can give us more of a moral truth. So could you give us maybe some fiction book recommendations as well?
I'm now listening to the collected short stories of Eudora Welty, one of the great national treasures. She lived her life in Mississippi, part of that great outpouring of Southern talent, Faulkner, and others, Robert Penn Warren, Peter Taylor, another author of great short stories. I think people need stories. I think they do refresh the brain cells. One can become saturated with history and with political thought and current arguments, and to go into another world that is created by the real masters of the craft who know how to illuminate the human condition.
Mr. Will, thank you so much for your time here today. It's been a real pleasure.
I've enjoyed it. I applaud more than you can know someone like you standing up for the primacy of the printed word and particularly the primacy of books.